while other people are arriving, I wanted to just say welcome to all of you and would love to hear, before we start with the actual program, to hear why did you join this session today? What motivated you to be here?
Well, I was triggered by the word new in the title. So, I have followed the course in Holland, and but I'm not using it today on a daily basis. But I try to introduce some patterns in my daily job to make things better. And but when I hear or read the word new, I'm always triggered to see what I can learn.
Right, okay. It worked. We were going to add half price as well, but we decided not.
Free usually, it's even better. Great. Other things that brought you here?
I was triggered by two things that I want to. Yeah, I was happy to join back in some way to see you all. But the main reason was that when I saw the process like overview, it was something I thought I often encounter in daily in our meetings, something that happens a lot, that we are trying to stick to the process, but discussions emerge. So how to include them, and a lot of there's a lot of let's say like a gift in it, a lot of wisdom maybe in what can happen in if it's not just sticking to something but trying to combine. And I thought maybe that's where this could go today, and I was really triggered a lot by that.
Okay, thank you, Raphael. Okay, let's hear from Christian. Did you want to say something?
Sure.
Yeah.
It's my second session with the S3 community. I'm not an S3 expert. I know some decision-making methods or paths from Sociocracy, original one, or from Polarization. So I'm just curious what I can learn today. That's all.
Hey, great.
That was enough trigger for me.
Yeah, thank you. So let's hear maybe one more person, if you want to bring a slightly different angle that motivated you to be here.
Yeah, I'm the party breaker. I was motivated, but then I found out I could not join, and so my meeting ended earlier than expected, so I was remotivated. And I joined.
Okay. Welcome, Christoph. I'm glad you could make it. And JC, I think you also signaled you might want to share.
Yes, quickly. I was just wanting to make sure that reasoned decision-making was not going to supplant consent decision-making. So that's why I'm here.
Good. I can nail that one immediately, JC. It's definitely not. Not as far as I'm concerned anyway. So see you later. It was great you came.
Okay. So thank you, all of you, for being here. Just to briefly tell you what's going to happen. We're planning to explore a little bit this idea of reason and reasoned decision-making, where it's coming from and how is it relevant for us today and in the world. And then I'd like to give you some background, how we got to making this pattern explicit in the menu, and then run you through it. And then we're going to just open up for questions and reflections from all of you. That's the plan. So I'm going to straight off just pass it to James, because he's going to help us build a bridge to how we got to the idea of reason in the world today and here and now. James.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Lily. So there might be a bit of repetition in all of this, but I want to proceed saying too much about the topic by inviting some reflections from some of you around this topic of reason. As many of you are aware, sociocracy invites that people at least be reasonable. So I want to look a little bit at the history of that and why reason plays such a key role in the evolution of sociocracy. And as you know, there are various patterns in sociocracy developed first conceived of by Auguste Comte, but then developed by Gerard Endenberg with the Sociocratic circle method. And now with S3, we actually document 3 process patterns specifically relating to decision-making. That's consent decision-making, testing arguments, qualifiers, objections, and resolving objections, like 2 subset patterns of consent decision-making. So sociocracy is kind of inviting us to consider arguments, to speak up and bring disagreement if we believe there's reasons to disagree, to test hypotheses and pay attention to the consequences of our actions and inactions in the world, and learn from the outcomes of what we do and what we don't do. So valuing logical coherence and evidence has a long history in sociocracy, and it has an even longer history in the world in terms of our ancestors and the journey that they undertook. So we're all beneficiaries in some way of many of the situations in the past when reasoning and empiricism were applied to our ancestors. I say reasoning and empiricism deliberately. So you kind of got the rationalists and the empiricists. It's kind of like nature-nurture argument. It's just obsolete as far as I'm concerned. They both have place and relevance somehow, and we shouldn't over-identify with one or the other. But applying reasoning and empiricism helped our ancestors to make more sense of the world and improve the decisions that they made. And we, in many ways, have benefited immensely as a consequence of that. So this is our topic for today, to explore the benefits of exercising reason in decision-making and look at this, our attempt to document that pattern. But before that, I don't know about you, but I look at the world today and I see that there are many situations where reason is also sorely absent. In fact, some people express concerns that we might even face the potential of a descending new dark age. I haven't read the book, but I have come across it, James Bridle's book, New Dark Age. Have any of you read that? No? Okay, well, basically in the book, he contends that an overload of information has hurt our ability to understand the world. AKA, we're just inundated by information, primarily through medium like this, being online, media, internet, and so on. So I wanted to ask you the question to get some of your thoughts and insights on what examples you see of an absence of willingness, or maybe sometimes even just ability, like the skill set to engage in reasonable discourse, and how bringing more reasonableness and empiricism into important situations that you're aware of in the world today could help to more effectively deal with the challenges and opportunities we face. So examples of where you look in the world and you think, perhaps a little more willingness to engage in reasonable discourse, to seek logical coherence, to consider evidence and to look for subtlety and nuance and assume a more high resolution perspective could help us more than perhaps what we see otherwise in terms of polarizing somewhat around less evidence-based ideological lines. And I wanted to hear some examples of things you see, or maybe things even that concern you in the world today.
I think, James, that the most obvious thing is, of course, the way Corona is handled at the moment.
Do you want to, for fear of reprimand or being cancelled or something, do you want to say something more about that, like something specific?
Yeah, the thing is that in many countries now, the people who are determining what has to be decided are mostly the virologists and people concerning with epidemiology and stuff like that. But they forget that there is also other parts that need to be considered, like well-being of people, like economics, like weighing the benefits and the costs to each other. Meaning that, for instance, there has been a calculation from somebody that says that to keep one kid out of the hospitals under 11. We have to vaccinate them, but we will risk to put in 4 into the hospital with cardiomyocytes and stuff like that. So these are things that, they have not been considered enough for me, at least.
Yeah, sure. So you're also pointing towards the enormous complexity around this situation and many others
Absolutely.
besides. And this isn't something where we can just swiftly come down
Absolutely.
one way or the other.
Yeah. And you see the reactions in Europe quite well, and maybe across the world as well, that more people are demonstrating about the measurements that we take at the moment. And I'm not saying that, well, I think that something needs to change anyway. So doesn't mean that the measurements have to be completely become obsolete, but still, that's not my decision to make anyway. But trying not to polarize myself too much.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks, Frank. I think it's quite an obvious situation for many of us. Christoph, you had your hand up there.
Yes, it's not so long ago I was an advocate for reason, and I would very clearly know what reason is. I kind of lost this idea that I know what reason is, because I see everyone knows what reason is, but these reasons somehow, they're not the same reason. So there's different reasoning, and I wouldn't say mine is better than any other, even though I would like to, but it feels wrong. Mm-hmm. When you said the word empiricism, that actually added a new layer to it, because you can reason within a context of very coherent ideas that may be totally wrong, but still coherent and kind of appealing. But when it comes to empiricism, there's a new story. So you kind of need to, prove it, or have any kind of hints from reality that would then maybe change the way you create your reasoning bubble. So actually, I think empiricism nowadays is more important than reasoning.
Okay. Yeah, I think you point to a problem. We can reason anything. If you're artful with language, you're persuasive, you can overwhelm people with a load of babble that sounds convincing somehow, then people can be persuaded regardless. And this is marriage between reasoning and empiricism. So we can argue something, we can be convinced even, but are there ways then that we can actually experiment to learn whether or not this is the case? Yeah, and test our own hypotheses is really important. I heard Sam Harris recently in a conversation talking about the synergy between logical coherence and evidence. He said we need to value both, right? In synergy, not one or the other. It's not a thing to polarize on. Both are important. Jonas.
Yeah, hi. I love that you just raised Sam Harris, because for me he's like the pinnacle of reason in all this confusion. But and I also want to resonate with Christoph. And I was just thinking from the principle of continuous improvement. If I think about that, to me, it also kind of implies that as an individual or as a group, you should always be ready to continue to improve. And you can only continue to improve if you're not there yet. And I think that's like a basic assumption, that individually or as a group, we're never there. We're never right. We've never reached kind of an end stage where we are right and everything else is wrong. And you can always continue to learn. And to me, that's at the core of being open to reasoning. And I think that's also, for me, at the core of this polarization problem, where I think people do the opposite and take the assumption that they are right and the others are wrong. And, that leads to all that suffering. So, that's what I encounter in my work, and in all these public debates and confusion. It's being open to accepting. In fact, a doctor recently said to me, and I really liked what he said. He said, the more I see people high up in organizations and in government, the more I realize we're all just doing whatever. There's this whole idea that we're super professional and that the standard of what we do is super high, like where this bar is. It's like a fiction, and we should all kind of accept that we're just doing the best we can and stay open to reason and to learn that there's possibility for improvement.
Yeah, thanks, Jonas. That's one thing that stood out from what you said, was this staying open to reason, being willing to first show our own reasons, but also to be humble, to reflect on our own reasoning, and to be open to other people's reasoning as well. And it's kind of that interface, often between what appears to be a diversity of perspectives, maybe even apparently irreconcilable opposites at first glance, that can lead us towards a more high resolution synergistic perspective where we start to see essential value in these different points of view. And which for me is fundamentally why I believe we learned to cooperate and collaborate as a species to begin with, because life was just so complex that none of us are smart enough to navigate that complexity alone. And therefore, we learned to rest into one another because we're stronger together, we're more conscious together, more intelligent together, and we can navigate the world more effectively than we could ever do apart. So thanks. Yeah. Anyone else? Any other last examples of an absence of willingness to reasonableness? Gibbs.
Yes. Yeah. What triggered me to join is because in life, you also hear a lot of reasoning, but the yes, but reasoning, reasons not to do things. And I'm here to investigate how it matches consent decision making and the constructive reasoning, because it takes courage to change, and people like to stay where they are, which is the cause of the yes but behavior sometimes. So I'm here to see how it fits in.
Great. Okay. We can explore some yes and scenarios. And if there's going to be a yes but, then at least have the courage to add no at the end of it and then give your argument for why. Yeah. Okay, great. Anyone else who's going to feel remiss if you don't have a chance to share right now? Because if so, I'd love to hear from you, and then we're going to move on. Okay, well, thanks. Personally, I could just go down that road for the rest of the session because I find it so interesting hearing your thoughts and reflections about this. But let's move on then. As some of you know, I'm no historian and I'm no philosopher, but I do like to kind of dig around a little bit before a call like this just to see if there's anything that stands out for me that I'm excited about and could share. In a former session in the community, I spoke a bit about Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and their kind of role in kind of bringing emphasis towards reason. And if we roll forward, there was the scientific revolution. I didn't know that it was the 1543 was seen as by many as the start date of the scientific revolution, and that was down to Copernicus and his ideas on the revolution of the heavenly spheres, which we've quoted in literature regarding S3. So he's often cited as marking the beginning of the scientific revolution, and this led obviously to the Age of Enlightenment, also known as the Age of Reason. So I was doing a quick Wikipedia search, so I don't count on the total truth of this, but things that stood out for me were that period included a range of ideas centered not only on the value of reason, the pursuit of knowledge, but also on the value of human happiness attained by means of reason and the evidence of the senses, so empiricism, and ideas such as liberty, progress, toleration, fraternity, constitutional government, and separation of church and state. And that's where the lights came on for me, because someone I am more familiar with is Auguste Comte. And of course, Comte in 1851 apparently coined the term sociocracy as a way to describe what he saw as an inevitable and essential way of governing nation states. So a form of government that would elevate above a fundamentalist perspective to embrace reasoning and empiricism, to be able to create more robust decisions that were in service of the members of the state. And so this was where the concept of sociocracy first emerged. Many of you know that, maybe some of you didn't, but it's got quite a long history in that regard. And so what was many things interesting for me about Comte, but one of them was that he actually foresaw the role of social scientists in government. He saw the importance of experts, so people who had exposure to information, perhaps that the general masses wouldn't have, to play a key role in decision-making. And he said this was inevitable. And I've been both kind of positive and critical, I think, of the role of social scientists in shaping modern day society, because, you know, that can be done for better or worse. And perhaps we see both sides of that coin in the world that we live in today. But I'm saying that because although sociocracy translates as rule by the social group, back then, Comte and later Lester Frank Ward very much saw an emphasis still on experts ruling the people, but doing that in a manner that was in service of the needs of the people. And it wasn't really until Case Bucher and Betty Cadbury came along in the 1920s and started to play around with some of these ideas and synergize them with Quaker thinking and the idea of consensus and so on, that this started to pivot more towards this central focus of equivalence and people affected by decisions making and evolving those decisions. And of course, Gerard Endenberg came along in the 60s and 70s, saw some of the shortcomings of consensus and evolved this idea of consent, which was really pulling on some of Comte's early thoughts and those that had come before him as well, to say, what would it look like if we were to shift supremacy from people? So in autocracy from individuals and small groups, in majority decision-making from the majority, in consensus decision-making from whoever blocks a decision moving forward, and shift supremacy from people to an abstraction called reasoned argument. And that's the thing that makes consent decision-making so different, is supremacy to objection, supremacy to argument over any person. So if you hadn't thought about that before, do kind of keep that in mind, because for me, this is one of the defining characteristics. It's easily overlooked, but it's why consent applied as a principle throughout a whole system is so powerful, because ultimate supremacy lies with reasoned argument, not with any person. Okay. So consent as a principle then is really supporting us to harness distributed intelligence, to seek out what's most plausible. This is a term I picked up recently from John Vervaeke. If you haven't come across Vervaeke, he's got a 50-part series on YouTube called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. It will completely blow your mind. I'll put the link in the chat in a minute when I finish talking. But plausibility, he's breaking down the evolution of consciousness and how we are seeking out that which is most plausible, most salient, and within that salience landscape, that which is most plausible to us within a certain context. And so this is really what adopting the principle of consent is seeking to bring: harness distributed intelligence to broaden our salience landscape, to identify what's most plausible, and to also rigorously test that through the perspective of the different stakeholders who are involved for any kind of logical incoherence or inconsistency with what evidence shows. So that's my background kind of introduction to the whole topic of reason in decision-making, building a segue to sociocracy and consent. And I'm going to hand over to Lily to introduce the pattern.
Yes, I was going to give a background first of how we got to making this pattern, and then I'm just going to briefly run through it. So it started in our just continuous exploration of this question: how can we support people to understand the mechanics behind consent decision-making, behind how we can test whether an argument qualifies as an objection or not, and how to resolve objection in an effective way. And in one of our meetings, while we were exploring different ways of visualizing and thinking about this, we just sort of became so obvious that there is a well, back then we called it a meta pattern. There is a recurrence of a few steps in all of these processes. And we thought, would it add value if we would actually tell people about these steps? Because they are repeating basically in slightly with slight variations. But if you actually understand the basic steps, it sort of makes the whole process of decision making, which can be at times quite confusing, and you go down different layers of abstractions, you need to come back up and so on. And we thought that making those steps explicit might help people. So that was about 1.5 years ago. And so, as we often do with many of the things we're putting in the actual guide, we tested it. So we started telling people about it, and we failed miserably because sometimes things got more complicated. But after about 1 year and a half of thinking about it and coming it down to the essence, we believe this is valuable process to know in itself, because it doesn't tell you how you go through each of the steps. It just provides a frame, and people can fill it in with whichever processes or practices they would like as well. So that's how we got to the process. We called it reasoned decision making, because essentially it's for any group of people who comes together and wants to use reason as a basis for their decision-making process. So it's not it's not useful for any other situations, right? When they want to, I don't know, use other means of deciding. So basically, reasoned decision-making, it always starts by somebody presenting something. We call that a subject. So, somebody could say, let's do X, or they present the proposition that something is in a certain way. So there is a starting point and somebody presents it. Then you always need to make sure that everybody else understands what's being presented. And then there's a check, a moment of sort of checking whether anyone disagrees with the subject, right? They either question the viability of what I'm proposing or the validity of the argument I brought, right? And this is a check. We're not going into details. Often hand signs are useful because you just have a visual representation of, okay, where are we standing, right? And if there is no disagreement, you celebrate because you made an agreement. You went ahead with something, right? And if there is a disagreement, you proceed to what we call dispute. Dispute is that process where you determine whether the disagreement has validity, right? So you need to hear why does somebody disagree and determine whether that has any validity or not. And if it does have validity, then you integrate somehow the information revealed and improve your subject. And then you go back to check. And if there's no more disagreements, you will celebrate. So that's the basic process. For those of you who know consent decision-making, that probably sounds quite familiar, but I want to go ahead and just explore what the differences are. Okay. So consent decision-making, first of all, we're making explicit the step before actually presenting a proposal, right? So in consent decision-making, we're explicitly testing proposals, right? So first of all, we need to agree on the driver for this proposal. Why is this proposal on the table? What purpose does it serve? Okay. And then we also have a brief response, which is a chance for everybody to just share their thoughts and ideas before expressing any disagreement in particular. Okay. And then also once we celebrate, we consider concerns. So concerns are those things that don't stop proposals becoming agreement. But we, if people do feel concerned, we do have a step at the end to consider that, just to make the distinction between something that, let's say, could lead to a consequence with a want or a risk or a worthwhile improvement, and anything else that could be an opinion or something that cannot be proved or disapproved otherwise, but is still sort of present for people. Okay. So now I think what's important to understand is that these two steps, dispute and integrate, they relate to two other patterns in S3. So how do we dispute, right? That we have the pattern test arguments qualify as objections, and how do we integrate whatever information comes from a qualified objection? We have resolve objections, okay? And this is the moment where you're going to start to see the recurrence, because how do you dispute? Well, basically you go through reasoned decision-making again. Okay, so let me show you that. So when we're testing arguments to see whether they qualify as objections, we start by hearing one argument, okay? So somebody presents their argument, then we make sure people understand it. Sometimes it's just like implicit. People understand it, go on. Sometimes people ask, oh, wait a minute, I don't get this. Can you say it again? And so on. And then we check. Anybody disagrees that this argument is valid, right? That's like a short way of putting it. We're looking specifically in when determining whether an argument is an objection or not to those two things, risk or consequence of harm or worthwhile improvement, okay? And if there is no disagreement, then it means the argument qualifies as an objection, right? So we can celebrate because we determined that. And then we would go to the next step, which is that we need to resolve this objection, okay? But if somebody disputes, right? If somebody says, no, actually, I disagree with this argument, then we need to dispute it again, right? So this is where things get complicated because you go a layer down. So we want to hear why this person disagrees with argument one, right? So then we go through the same process, and there, if it's the second argument is not disputed, then we celebrate. The arrow goes wrong, it should go to celebrate. Oh no, actually no, it was correct. It goes to integrate. Yeah, but if somebody disputes it again, we go through the third layer, which is, but this is where people mostly get confused. But what I want to show you here is it's the same process you're going through, basically. You're following the same steps: present, understand, check, and then dispute means presenting argument, understanding argument, checking, dispute, and so on. And in terms of resolving objections, it's literally the same process again. So integrate, right? How do we integrate? Well, what comes in here is the idea of an amendment. Okay, so you have the same process, but this time you're presenting an amendment. You're understanding an amendment and so on. So by amendment, we mean something that you can add, remove, change to the Is there something else? Maybe I forgot. Add, remove, change.
Yeah, no, that's good.
No, okay. That you would add, remove, change to the proposal. And that would somehow resolve the objection. Okay, so there is a implicit step here that you need to come up with that amendment somehow, right? And once you came up with it, then you present it to others and then make sure everybody understands it and so on. So you got the idea. I think this slide just goes to the end. Okay, so you check. Does anybody want to disagree or question the viability of this amendment? Okay, so we're focusing on a little tiny bit of the proposal, which is like something to change, not the whole thing. And then if nobody disputes it, we celebrate. And if somebody does, then we go through the same process again. Now, you might already have seen that we've put now a detailed description of consent decision-making, and we're now following up with a detailed description of testing arguments and resolving objections. So that will hopefully give you more insight. That's all I had to say. I don't know if there's something more to say, or we can just straight off open for questions. Probably there's more I could go into, but I think I spoke enough.
Let's do it.
Yeah. So let's open up.
Ready?
Let's open up for reflections, questions, things that stand out for you or are unclear. Anything.
What I like about the concept is that it's how you showed it's really everywhere in consent decision making. So it's which in turn means that valuing and focusing on the reasoned argument is really built in every step of consent decision making, and probably also many other patterns where something similar could be shown alone through the fact that consent decision making is an important part also of other patterns.
Yeah. You actually just in the chat, Timo, if any of you missed it, Timo was just pointing out that the reasoned decision-making, for example, you will find in consent to driver. So if you're doing that in the moment of pulling in a pattern like consent decision-making or proposal forming, then obviously you're applying reasoned decision-making to test the propositions. So in this case, the subject is the summary of the driver as a proposition that it's both relevant and clearly described. And so reasoned decision-making has been applied in both cases, not because people learned reasoned decision-making, but just because that's what people do if they're thinking about stuff and trying to approach this in a reasonable way. And I see your hand, Dennis, so I'll come to you, but I wanted to just pick up on something you said, Timo, because I know many of you are involved in helping others to learn about and experiment with S3 as well. And for me, like the reason this has just been so valuable to flesh out, even though it took incredibly long, like most of the patterns do, to flesh out, is as a teacher. Because, years ago, we just had consent decision-making. And I used to facilitate processes after many years of practice, and people would say, oh, wow, you make it look so easy. And I was kind of like, but it is easy, actually. But it's not easy. If you're new to it, it looks really, really complicated. And it's kind of like magic. You don't really know what happened. And this was what led to us describing test arguments, qualifiers, objections as a pattern and resolve objections as a pattern. Because even though they're kind of recursive of consent decision-making in many ways, having that extra explanation, breaking it down, gives people that learning scaffold, where they can build up understanding over time. But we found it wasn't enough. And so the same story came up years later with testing arguments, qualifiers, objections as well. People are like, but it seems so complicated. It just blew my mind. I can't follow this. And we were thinking, but it's so simple. So what's simple? And what's simple is reasoned decision-making. It's just a recursive pattern that's the same again and again and again. But if you don't have that lens, you can't kind of orientate and figure out where exactly you are. And so integrating this perspective helps you know where you are at any time in all three of those process patterns. So whilst it's a pattern in its own right, and as you inferred, Timo, we see it out there in many ways in the world, as someone who's helping others learn about these process patterns, it's an incredibly useful tool because it really supports putting in place that learning scaffold for people to kind of stand upon to be able to make more sense of these other processes. Dennis, thanks for your patience.
Oh, no problem. I have a question let me know if I'm splitting hairs here. In the guide, in the definition of reasoned decision-making in the very first paragraph, reasoned decision-making is to reach agreement on what is considered viable, relevant, valid, or empirically true. Mm-hmm. And then I said, well, empirically true, for me, it would be empirically knowable or testable. Mm-hmm. With this idea, we're going to do an experiment that's good enough for now, And but we know we're going to find something. So we're not going to agree to something that we're not going to have an answer. So it's not empirically true right now, but we're going to know it with this experiment. I guess it's my background coming back.
Yep. Well, then viable would be the term here, because it's a proposition. We conduct an experiment to test a particular hypothesis. Does it make a difference if we emphasize the or here rather than an and, Dennis?
Yeah, and I think that is actually important to emphasize, because the reason why there are all those 4 words is because they refer to both proposals that we need to agree upon and arguments people present that we need to determine whether they're valid or not. So the empirically true part comes in when somebody presents an argument and we can, we're thinking at least, can this be proven? Or can this be tested? Can this be? Yeah.
Sure.
Does it make sense? And Dennis?
Yeah, of course. I think I was splitting hair a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that, because we definitely split a few hairs when we wrote that phrase as well.
Yeah, and we definitely spent probably at least an hour. I remember having that conversation. Damn it, what words are going to be clear enough? It's not easy describing these things. Okay, what else? Christoph.
Lily, you said that differences to consent decision making. One difference was, I wrote it down, explicitly test proposals in consent decision making. Does it mean you do, what kind of actions do you then do? If it's not only proposals, what else is it that you treat as subjects?
Yeah, so the other thing you would do is determine the validity of an argument. Yeah, so you could argue it's a proposal that this argument is true, and then you would, through the process, determine yes or no, it is true. But that's the other option, right? So reasoned decision making can be applied to any subject, and the subject can be either a proposal, like in the case of consent decision making. That's the starting point, right? The input. And in testing arguments qualify as objections, the input is or the starting point is the argument somebody presents. And in resolve objections, the input, the starting point, is an amendment.
This chart I just shared here, this is something we added into the guide with the pattern description there, just to show the different subjects. But again, as a teacher, this is somewhere where people their minds get a bit blown to start with, because you say, well, you're proposing a proposal, and then you're proposing an argument qualifies as an objection. And then you're testing to see if other people disagree totally or partly that argument qualifies as an objection. So you could say you're seeing if there's any possible objections to the proposed possible objection. And then you've lost people, because it's just too confusing for people. And so having a bit of distinction in the language that you use for each of these process patterns, CDM, test arguments, and resolve objections, is helpful, we found. This is why we, in test arguments qualify as objections, for us, we check, does anyone disagree totally or partly this argument qualifies as an objection? Please raise your hand if you do. Right. Of course, to start with, people do, am I meant to do this or this or this? Right. But by giving different kind of rituals for each of these patterns, once people learn those rituals, it just helps them, again, orientate a little bit more where they are.
Yeah, but it's a good question, Christoph. I think in a way, they're all proposals. Yeah, so you were spot on. Yeah. Anything else?
Hi. Thanks.
Hi.
First of all, I think thanks a lot, because this pattern, I think, is simpler to understand what is the process and to. I have been using Sociocracy since maybe last year, and it was very helpful. I work with management teams, and really works very well with the thing I work. And when you show these steps, I was thinking about actually this what is a proposal, and because a lot of times the people has opinions, no proposals. So this is, I think, this is very important first step, because the opinion is something that maybe is in your imagination. You think that things are that, but the reality is other, and you haven't checked in reality what is happening. So in this world, I say in this world is almost everything is valid, and it's no work for the team to move through some subject. So I think this first step, the proposal, is very important, to have some data, for example, something to validate that what I'm saying has something back in reality. And the next step is, and it's important in the mechanics, is understand the proposal. I think is if the team knows that the second step is to try to understand the proposal and asks about the clarity of the proposal, and know to give opinions, because everybody again wants to give his opinion. No, know your opinion. What is your doubt? What is your question? I think this is very powerful to really move through. I think the process, the steps are very common sense. Is the things that actually have to do, but then try to move in this way with the people is very important, because otherwise is opinions and hours and hours of meeting and nothing left of this. So that's Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. And it's good to hear you're finding value in this. Yeah. Where are you based in Spain?
I'm based in Spain. I am in Spain since December. It's not for some subject in my country with violence, but I'm working with companies in this moment, companies in Colombia. That is my place.
And where are you living in Spain?
In Pals, Catalonia.
Oh, okay. We're in Barcelona, so.
Oh yes,
nearby.
So we have to take a coffee.
Yeah, yeah, let's do it. Great, thank you.
Let's hear Christian.
Yeah, just a question, a quick one, perhaps, regarding the context. As I'm not so familiar with S3 patterns, do I understand you right that there are current patterns in place which you're calling consent decision-making, test arguments, qualifiers objection, and resolve objects, and this one, the reasoned decision-making, is an additional one?
Yeah,
exactly. And that I wanted to say something on this, Christian. So a few days ago, somebody read my LinkedIn post where I was sharing this pattern in a company that's using consent decision-making. And she explained to me that she went off and tried to apply reasoned decision-making. Oh no, she was thinking to apply reasoned decision-making with her team the next day. And I said, don't do that. I said, use consent decision-making. So consent decision-making is a process that really lays out steps that you can follow. And we recently updated the pattern description in the guide with a lot of tips and tricks as well for how to go through each of those steps. I generally wouldn't recommend saying to people, follow reasoned decision-making as an alternative. It's still consent decision-making essentially, but it's missing some vital steps that are presupposed as having been covered, but might not be. And so reasoned decision-making is a bit like another pattern we have in S3 called co-create proposals. It's very similar to a pattern called proposal forming, but proposal forming is a much more kind of thorough and laid out process that people can follow, whereas co-create proposals just kind of points to that underlying framework, that underlying skeleton that underpins many approaches to co-creating proposals between stakeholders. So reasoned decision-making is the same in that sense. It's useful to know the pattern. If you see the pattern and integrate it into your being, then it will help you orientate and navigate. But we're not proposing to use reasoned decision-making as an alternative to consent decision making instead.
Jonas?
Okay. I'm listening carefully. It makes me more curious to understand more the differences. So I will make a deep dive on it.
Yeah. Did you catch the presentation of Lily earlier? Because it's a lot of information, but in the illustration there, she was showing how the added steps in consent decision making are presenting consent to driver first, and having a brief response round, having checked people understand the proposal. And that's an often overlooked but very powerful step in consent decision making, because you get a different perspective on the proposal because you're viewing it through different people's perspective, different people's eyes. And that adds a layer of subtlety in terms of information about the proposal that you'd be missing otherwise. So those two steps are fundamental to consent decision making. And I think it would be unfortunate often if they were missed. But yeah, do take a look at the other pattern descriptions, and you should start to see how these things fit together.
Thanks.
I wanted to continue in the same spirit as Christian, just to check my understanding. Because I heard you in your presentation, Lily. I heard you say, I heard you use the words kind of meta pattern. And through this question from Christian and the answer from James, it also became clear to me what I'm kind of searching for in my mind, how to place this. And I'm just going to use, I think, two different words just to check whether I'm getting this. And so am I getting it that this is like a module that is kind of in place in different patterns that you've described in the past?
I guess you could use the word module.
Yeah. So would you say module is kind of similar to what you were indicating with meta pattern here?
Yeah. We decided that, meta pattern is not actually a helpful term to use.
Yeah.
But I guess module could be. You could think also as a skeleton or a frame, on which the other patterns. They're all built on the same frame.
Yeah. So it's giving insight into what's happening in those other patterns or what you might be doing. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
But it's also kind of laying out that underlying process of applying the rigor of reasoning to propositions that we can see historically over a very long period of time.
Yeah. So you've gone and really codified that process here.
Yeah, well, that's what we tried to do with S3. More or less effectively, but the patterns were there before S3 was, and we're saying, this is a really interesting pattern. It seems very useful in certain contexts. So let's see if we can codify it so people can have it conscious in their minds. So in a situation where the habitual approach is inadequate, they can flick through the menu, and see if there's something else that might be worth experimenting with instead. Yeah.
Nice. Okay, thank you.
Sarah.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. I was thinking regarding this, for me, it would be kind of architectural pattern. And also, is the same that proposal forming that you mentioned before. There are like two levels of patterns here. Some of them, as you said, you can just bring them to the group and use them for the process. But this pattern is really a different one. No? For me, I was thinking or some kind of scaffolding for the other patterns or some architectural pattern. No? So it's a different level. Because now with the explanation, I'm finding really useful to explain the other three regarding the consent decision making. And probably we will test it next month in the next training Adrian and I have. Let's see how people react to this pattern, because it's true. I agree with you, James, that the first time people receive this is like confusing. But if this pattern gives them the scaffolding or the architecture they need to put in their head, could be really useful. I'm still bugged a bit if this really should be a pattern or not, as we were discussing in the community. Because of that difference of level, no? A pattern is something that should be really ready to use, or is also the explanation of the things to use? But
yeah, I guess if that's, then co-create proposal shouldn't be a pattern either.
Yeah.
In that sense, I think we sort of thought that. Yeah. I recognize the distinction between ready to use versus sort of empty form saying, because we're explicitly saying, well, how you do each step, it's really down to you. And there are many ways to do it, and if you want a clear guidance on that, go to consent decision making or go to proposal forming. I think there is value in of it. How do you say that? I don't know the English way of saying it. They have value for themselves as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's independent value in and of itself. Yeah. If you remove the other three, then people would still find value in reasoned decision making, I would say. Yeah. Anyway, I think this is a splitting hairs, and it comes down to, well, what under what categorization would you qualify a pattern being present in S3 or not? Well, I know for me personally, my biggest interest is just helping people to integrate this wisdom for themselves. And in that respect, it would just be remiss to not share this, and having it on a separate site somewhere, that says, oh, check this out, would just be weird because it's so fundamental to these other three. So, but your point is well taken, Josera and Adrian, with your thumbs up too, and Zoltan, because I know that you brought this up at some point as well. But it's staying for now, at least. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yes, I was thinking during the presentation, and I think that James already mentioned that if you're already doing consent decision making, is it indeed a step back? Should I see it like this, that this is the next best thing? Because basically, if you go for consent decision making, the first step is consent to the driver. So why are we doing this? Only devote time to the things that help us achieving our goals. And now it happens in almost every meeting with people not trained in S3. They bring a proposal. Hey, I have an idea. Let's do this. And then the second step would be, why are we doing this? And then you're back at the driver, but you already have a proposal. Is it in this case like bringing in S3 like this? Or how should I see it? When would you prefer, or when would you say, hey, like a reasoned decision making is the better choice, both consent decision making?
Well, I think if we go back to the example that Frank was bringing, when we were looking for examples of where we see a lack of willingness to engage in reasonable discourse, seeking out logical coherence and valuing evidence, right? This would be a good example of where bringing more willingness to be reasonable into decision making is going to help, right? Because it's going to help us to discover nuance. It's going to help us to see these divergent points of view and so on. So one of the areas is valuable for me is just as an advocate for reasonableness in what sometimes otherwise can seem like a slightly crazy, deranged, ideologically polarized world. And I think that's going to get worse before it gets better in many places as well. So as a way to just speak about argument, and the appropriateness of arguing and where to place that in a dialogue, from proposition via checking for understanding to see whether there are any disputes in and of itself is profoundly valuable. In my work in the past with kids, teaching them this was so useful, and then teaching them how to dispute in a healthy way, to teach them what some of the parameters were for presenting an argument and the necessity of presenting an argument in a manner that's plausible and that relates to the objectivity of the environment in which they're raising their kind of dispute and so on. So I think there's many implications for this for us on a species level. But if it comes to a group of people who are confronted by a wish to up the standard of their decision-making, to integrate reason into their practice, then I would be inclined to pull in consent decision-making, but I would be helping them to just integrate that lens that reasoned decision-making provides as a basis so they can orientate through the complicatedness of those other three processes.
I'd add to this sorry, James.
No, that's fine. I just wanted to check if that was an adequate answer to your question. Yeah.
Maybe we can check after I add this as well,
Okay.
which is that I believe it's really important to check for any objections on the driver before considering a proposal. And this is what is important to understand is that in reasoned decision making, the starting point is when you have a proposal. So it's sort of implicit that you agree that there is a problem and that proposal is intended to fix it, right? So that's why consent to driver is not in there. But even in consent decision making, like ideally you would have like agreed on what the problem is before the proposal was created. Then however the process of creating the proposal, when you're coming together, you just check the proposal and so on. So
Christoph.
And Jonas was with us.
Okay, so Christoph and then Jonas.
I may share some experience that I have as a teacher, not specifically with S3, but actually today I had a session where I tried to introduce a concept of a responsibility process to a team that has no clue about that, and I found myself simplifying it to a way that I thought would be digestible for those people. And I guess reasoned decision making is such an option to simplify things in a language that people can understand without using these fancy words like objection and driver and stuff that people would say, what the fuck is happening here?
Exactly.
So it's like an empty shell to introduce phrases that fit that very purpose that you're in. And so scaffolding, I think, is a good analogy. You fill it with whatever makes sense in the given context.
Yeah.
So that's my understanding.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Thanks, Christoph. So I think there was Jonas, and then we go to Herman.
Yeah. Question. At the beginning, we looked at some of these examples where reason might be a valuable pattern to insert, and one of us raised the current corona pandemic as a situation that obviously leads to such examples. And I think I remember listening to Sam Harris recently. It might have been his Ask Me Anything, where this point is raised that that we all encounter situations in various settings where we might encounter a non-reasonable, or in our eyes non-reasonable opinion, and then not really know how to handle that conversation. And I think this was specifically related to vaccines, and that because there's a lot of ideas circulating about the efficacy of vaccines and dangers of vaccines, and some of this is less empirical than you might want, and there's all this misinformation, social media, etc. stuff going on there. And I think Sam said that he has no idea how to handle such a conversation. And my question is, are you now proposing a possible, S3 by stealth pattern that might help you navigate through such a conversation? And if so, then could you maybe try to play that out a little bit, how that might work?
Well, firstly, on my understanding of Sam Harris, he very much understands the usefulness of engaging in a dialogue with this as a kind of foundational basis to orientate your way through. And also, if we take the example of the coronavirus pandemic, he fully appreciates the enormous complexity of many situations that we face, the multidimensionality of that, and actually the impossibility of coming down in any one particular place without multiple trade-offs across these different poles. Right? So I don't think it's anything new to him, and he would speak far more eloquently about these things than me, and I'm sure. In a way, I'm not proposing that reasoned decision-making would provide a way through. But what I observe is that people's willingness to engage in conversation with some humility, to dare to bring forward their perspectives, their experience, and their ideas, and to be open to hear others as well, with the openness to the possibility there might be something valuable in what they say, there may be more or less truthfulness in it, and the same might be true of what other people bring too. And to be in a process of continual kind of midwifery to birthing that which might be a little bit wiser than what we had before and applying that wisdom to what we do next is about the best that we can do. But if there's an unwillingness to engage in reasonableness, as I opened with at the start of this call, sociocracy is inviting us to at least be reasonable. And that's so damn difficult because often we're running on our habitual behaviors, which reveal deeply entrenched values that we've identified with, for the fact that they help us to orientate through life and get our sometimes very deep basic needs met. And so confronted by something that challenges our values can take us to a pre-rational, very fundamentalist place where we dig in to our habitual ways of seeing the world because we learned that that's how we stay safe. And so to be reasonable invites us to become conscious of our identifications, to become conscious of our belief systems, the things that we value to the cost of something else, and to confront our tendency to dice the world up in a binary way. It's inviting us to elevate our consciousness beyond either or to both and more. And this is why we talk about this a lot in S3. You have to be willing to undergo that journey in a given moment. You have to be willing to embrace consciously the vulnerability that otherwise would be cared for habitually by your habitual ways of behaving, right? That we are immediately vulnerable when we're challenged in the ways that we see the world. And I think that's what's important. You need that willingness. And so among a group of people who are committed to undertake that journey together, can support one another, can have as much compassion as they have understanding for the process, but compassion for what this involves, can enable a field of psychological safety where people are more willing both to speak up without fear of retribution, but also more open to see the nuance and diversity in different points of view. Yeah, doesn't mean to say we're going to come up with better answers. We might not, right? But it's going to create a field where people are willing to try. And without willingness, you need consent to play the game of consent, right? That's a fundamental operating requirement. Does that answer your question, Jonas? Well,
yeah, thanks. That's very fundamental and insightful. Thanks.
Okay. Hernan, then Raphael, and then I think we should probably move to wrapping up, Lily. What do you think?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, where is Hernan?
Hernan, you're muted.
Great.
Oh, okay.
So I have been using the driver with these teams. I think this is a very important component before and facilitate all the process. And this concept before anything that I have include with this group is look the company as a system, and we are a system. And this is maybe obvious, but the people doesn't have clear that they are all part of the same system. And this system is the result of the system is not the sum of the parts, is the interrelationship in between components. And this is, I think this is key component to move in this, as you say, in this compassion mood. Because if I don't feel like we are the same system and we have to be agreed to improve all, then everybody is fighting for his local optimal. Mm-hmm. And conversation trying to improve each one, his individuality is not productive. So I use the driver think as the first thing with this team, the management team, and it's a big driver. It's like our sellings is not is a big driver of the company, and then we move to with the scientific method, observation with data and to talk. Then we move again, like in a little driver maybe, but it's more like this process, like a proposal, check, and everything, all these steps. Mm-hmm. And so for me, this is very, very good, this process with when the people is conscious that they are the same system and they have to talk each other to move. It is no other way to do it. Mm-hmm. No isolate.
Yeah. So we define organization as any group of 2 or more people collaborating toward a common driver. And so what you're giving an example of there is the value of like delineating that common situation that people are motivated to respond to for whatever reasons and toward whatever ends. And the other thing I'm reminded of here is you're pointing out the fact that we are kind of interdependent with one another. So if we're moving from a kind of form of organization that's quite codependent, where you see parent-child relationships playing out, and then at some point, maybe some of us are going through this maturation process, but we're like rebellious teens, where we're radically individualizing and seeking to push back on whatever the restrictions are on ourselves. But at some point, there's this realization, well, wait a minute, I can't survive as an isolated silo on my own. I'm interdependent. What I do or don't do affects the rest of the system, and what others do or don't do affects me as well. And so this combination of a clear driver so that we're aware of what we're working on together, and then the recognition of our interdependence on one another to orientate in this complex world is like a fundamentally beneficial learning outcome to achieve among people. And it sounds like that's what you're working to, Hannah. So thanks for sharing that example. Raphael, let's hear from you. And then it would be great just to hear a few takeaways from people as well.
Okay, thank you. I would like to go back to this. You say it's a prerequisite to be open to reasoning, and otherwise you cannot even start. And of course, if somebody maybe is not open to go with this in the first place, maybe you can create a psychologically safe environment and so on, and find people. But if there remains only one person who is not open, will it stop the whole process, or what do you do? I mean, if you stay with the consent and they are not ready to be open, do you go back to majority vote and say everybody agrees, but not that one person? Or what do you do?
Okay. I thought of a story, actually. So no, I wouldn't go back to majority vote. I would be backing up to ask what's our contract around how we make decisions, and what's the driver that led to the fact that we were currently practicing with consent, right? That's where I'd want to start. But I think your question points toward a deeper issue here, and that's the issue of contracting. So I hear people sometimes, and they vent about being part of an organization and how distasteful it is, and how much they disagree with what's happening, and how unhappy they are, and blah, 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 blah. And my question to them, in the first world, at least, among those privileged enough to have some choice, is to ask, well, what are you doing there then? It doesn't sound like it's much fun. Maybe you want to make a different life choice. And it's that decision to contract with others that we make when we join an organization that is often taken so lightly or so overlooked. And it's a contract that goes both ways. This is why we have a pattern in S3 called Contract for Successful Collaboration, because what you're pointing toward is poor contracting from the start. Expectations weren't clear at the beginning. People's weren't fully clear on what their responsibilities were. The story is, I was contacted by a customer who said, James, we've had this young woman who's been working with us for 2 years. I think it was in marketing. She was working as a kind of junior in marketing with the idea of taking over from somebody else. And over 2 years, despite all the support, all the peer reviews, everything that they could do for her, she hadn't developed in a manner that was going to be suitable for her to take over the kind of senior role and for this other person to move on. So the other person hadn't moved on. And they came to realize actually that they would need to let this person go. And they were so conflicted because their agreement had been, you'll stay on and you'll skill up and then you'll take over this new role. It just so happened that this young woman was also regularly off sick. She was struggling with mental health difficulties as well. She was receiving support from the state and so on. And so, the idea of letting her go was kind of laden with guilt because they were concerned it would also tip her over the edge in terms of her other challenges as well. And to cut a long story short, what they learned was they hadn't contracted clearly from the start. And so to begin with, they were seeing kind of her as the problem, not in an uncompassionate way, but just like, oh no, how do we get out of this situation? And, she didn't follow through. But actually, at the end of the day, they saw how they hadn't really acted in a responsible enough manner either, and that they hadn't made that contract clear. And so they still let this young woman go, but they were able to do it in a manner where they could acknowledge their own part in this situation, having gone on for so long and led to this really unfortunate circumstance. And a learning for them was, oh, wow, contracting around employment is so important. And onboarding is so important. And if you're in a place where you can do it, maybe probationary period is important too, and so on and so forth. So if you've got to the point where you're in a team and you're using consent decision-making and someone's like, I'm not using that, you really want to back up and ask, okay, well, what are some of the foundational problems here? Because it's a symptom, it's not a cause. Yeah.
Yes, okay. But that's one specific situation. And I just wonder, maybe we don't need to go into details here, but what if it's the other way around and you're not onboarding someone and checking in the first place? You come to a group for whatever reason, and then you try to bring this in, and only one person would be blocking this, while it's an evolutionary step to bring it in.
Okay, I see. So you're saying that somebody is blocking not with a reason, but just saying no.
Yeah, behaving in this way, not accepting the process.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of relates to the same scenario, because at that point you have to look at the fact that you haven't clarified contract before. So if you want to bring consent decision making in and someone says, I don't want to play the game, and if I say no, and I don't want to have to justify myself, explain myself, I don't want my arguments tested by you to see whether or not they qualify according to these criteria and so on. That sounds like an important driver that you should probably prioritize over the one you're trying to make a decision about right now. Because you've got a systemic problem, right, in terms of an unwillingness to cooperate in some respect with a generally chosen trajectory of the team. And there's no S3 pattern that's going to help you with that. That's a human issue, right? But then you need to go back, what are we doing together here? Are we a group of people working together towards a common objective? Last thing on this, I used to suggest to people who were seeking to introduce consent decision-making into an environment where there was some hesitancy among people, to offer a basic explanation and invite everyone to go away and see if they could find any problems with that process and why it wouldn't work. Now, it's a bit sneaky, right? Because actually what you're doing is you're saying, go away, see if you can find any objections to using the process of consent decision-making. So they naturally go away and start looking for logical, coherent arguments that would demonstrate that. And of course, they don't find any either, right? So you kind of encourage people into a process of applying reason to a proposition to see whether they have any objections. And that would often turn a lot of people around who on first take were kind of objectionable to that somehow. But you can't force somebody to be reasonable, right? If you've ever tried reasoning with someone caught in a fundamentalist mindset, good luck to you. It's a loser's game. You're not going to get anywhere. And this is why I say you need consent to play the game. Consent. And if some people aren't willing to consent, you need to deal with that.
Timo. Yeah. So I'd like to just open up for final reflections. We have 4 minutes. Timo, I'm going to start with you. And let's just see if there's others of you who would like to jump in to just say something before the end.
My takeaway is clearly there's a very fundamental process of coming to group decisions based on reasoned argument that's visible and that's present everywhere in S3 and in organizations that use patterns from S3. And I think that's valuable in itself. And I find it very useful to have this additional pattern as a kind of a tool or a lens to look at things. Thank you.
Thanks, Timo.
I really liked, since I'm a musician, I really liked the matrix behind, or you called it like meta in the beginning. So it's like as I would learn like a C minor and a D major, and then suddenly I understand, there's something that connects them. So it's that feeling, and it's really, relieving in a way and insightful. And I made an enormous journey in the first 30, 40 minutes about myself, which has nothing to do with this, about me working in this company. And I'm happy that Martin is sitting next to me. I can share this later with him. So thank you very much for this session.
My takeaway is a new pattern. And I love it when you guys go nerdy. It really helps to be more conscious of what we're dealing with. And thanks for all the work you put in. So thanks for this session, because listening to you guys and all of you who joined gives the volume around the theory. And well, thanks. Yeah.
So I have a takeaway that is an empty container. So I call this scaffolding. An empty container is of enormous help when it comes to teaching, because more often than not, the right way, like the theoretical, you can read it in a book, is not understandable by people. So this is actually an observation of something very natural, and I would not try to follow it as a recipe. So this is not thought as a recipe. This is more thought as an explanation for something that happens anyway, very naturally. So it's like thinking of little muscle cells when you want to do a movement. It doesn't help you, but it helps you explaining if the movement doesn't work. So it's more the other way around for me. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Christoph.
Thanks.
So, folks, we're on the time. So if any of you were relying on us as a timekeeper because, I don't know, you're about to meet your new beloved or something, and if you're late, that's the end of that, then you want to be leaving now. But we'll keep the call open for a moment. I'm aware, Hernan, you wanted to just share a reflection, and maybe a couple of us if you do as well. So formally, let's close the call. Thank you so much for coming, your time, energy, and contribution. And any of you who want to stay on for some moments, please do. We'll keep the call open, and you're very welcome to hang out with us. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. See you guys.
Thank you.
Hi, and thanks for watching. My name is Lily David, and I'm a co-developer of Sociocracy 3.0. If you found this video useful, please like the video and subscribe. And if you're interested to learn more about Sociocracy 3.0, check out the S3 Academy website. You'll find links in the description below.